Well, hey, everybody. Welcome back to the podcast. This is your first time listening to Loving the Scriptures. Welcome. I'm so glad that you've joined us, and I hope that the things that we talk about in this episode will be beneficial and profitable for you spiritually. On this episode, what we're going to do is we're going to finish up our look at John chapter 8, which is part of our larger study of the book of John itself. We've been in chapter 8 for a handful of episodes. I want to say maybe about 4, with a break or 2 along the way. But we're going to finish up John chapter 8, and we're going to be looking at verses 48 through 59. And just as a reminder, remember that this is all within the same context of what we've been seeing, back in John chapter 7 with Jesus in the temple teaching during the Feast of Tabernacles, or the Feast of Booths is also what it would be called. And so in this, what Jesus has been saying, we've been seeing a little bit of a back and forth between Jesus and the Jews that were listening to him, most of them who are unbelievers, and they've been pushing back on him and challenging the things that he says. In other words, these are people who don't believe him. They don't take his word seriously. They don't believe that he was sent from the Father and that sort of thing. And so we've been seeing this back and forth, and that back and forth is going to continue here in this last section that we're going to be looking at in John chapter 8, but it's going to reach a fever pitch to the point where you have the Jews picking up stones to stone Jesus, but Jesus escapes from their grasp and he hides himself. So that gives you a little bit of a clue, just the heightened hatred that we're going to see towards Jesus by the end of this chapter. Now, this is a hatred that's kind of been present with many of these Jews for a long time, so it's not like we're seeing anything new. But again, this should come to show, just based on things that we've talked about in previous episodes and what Jesus has been saying, what we've been examining in past sections and past verses and things like that, that these are people, the people that Jesus is talking to, by and large, these are people who do not have a true knowledge, a true intimate, knowledgeable relationship of God with God the Father. Okay. And the proof in the pudding of that is that they reject the Son, and the Son was sent from the Father. So everything that the Son is saying, Jesus Christ is saying, is what he has been sent by the Father to do and to say. So if you're having objections from the Jews on that front, then it's obvious that these are people who do not know and do not love the Father, even though they claim that they do. And that's part of the things that we looked at last time, is that, you know, what was going on with these Jews was that they were making claims. They made claims, number one, of saying that we are children of Abraham. And Jesus went ahead and said, well, if you're truly children of Abraham, you would do the things that Abraham did, which, as we talked about last time, what Abraham did was that he accepted and followed the one true God in obedience and faith. And that's something that the Jews weren't doing. The Jews were the ones who wanted to kill Jesus instead, because they didn't like what he was saying. Now, what's the explanation for them not liking what Jesus is saying? Well, if Jesus is speaking the truth, which he is, it's going to go against what the Jews think and feel as far as, all those things are concerned, because they are, as Jesus says, of their father, the devil. See, they were ones who said that we have one Father, even God. And, Jesus is pretty much one who says that you are of your father, the devil. He explains, the characteristics of the devil, and saying that the devil speaks out of his own character, because every time he speaks, he lies, and he is the father of lies. And so this is an explanation as to why, when Jesus speaks the truth, they can't bear to hear the truth. They can't bear to hear the truth because they are of their father, the devil, who himself is the father of lies. Okay. And so in that section that we looked at last time, he closes things off by saying, I tell you the truth. Why do you not believe me? He says, if I tell the truth, why do you not believe me? Whoever is of God hears the words of God. The reason why you do not hear them is that you are not of God. So there it is, blanket straight out there. He says, you are not of God. All right. And there they are in the midst of a very important Jewish festival that they celebrate every year, doing everything that all the other religious Jews are doing around this time. And one would think that it's for religious purposes to honor God and everything like that. And here Jesus is in the midst of this festival saying that you are not of God. Okay. And as I said before, even the things that Jesus has been saying about them makes it pretty evident that these are people who do not know God and do not understand what his will is, because they're too focused on doing what their father's will is, who again, their father is the devil. They are of their father the devil. So that's kind of what we talked about last time. And as I said, we're gonna reach a fever pitch here by the end of the chapter. So let me go ahead and read the last section here in John chapter 8, starting in verse 48. And this is what it says here. It says, "The Jews answered him, Are we not right in saying that you are a Samaritan and have a demon? Jesus answered, I do not have a demon, but I honor my Father, and you dishonor me. Yet I do not seek my own glory. There is one who seeks it. He is the judge. Truly, truly, I say to you, if anyone keeps my word, he will never see death." The Jews said to him, "Now we know that you have a demon. Abraham died, as did the prophets. Yet you say, if anyone keeps my word, he will never taste death. Are you greater than our father Abraham, who died? And the prophets died. Who do you make yourself out to be?" Jesus answered, "If I glorify myself, my glory is nothing. It is my Father who glorifies me, of whom you say he is our God. But you have not known him. I know him. If I were to say that I do not know him, I would be a liar like you. But I do know him and keep his word. Your father Abraham rejoiced that he would see my day. He saw it and was glad." So the Jews said to him, "You are not yet 50 years old, and have you seen Abraham?" Jesus said to them, "Truly, truly, I say to you, before Abraham was, I am." So they picked up stones to throw at him, but Jesus hid himself and went out of the temple. My name is Steve Gill, and you're listening to Loving the Scriptures. Well, before we get into the text itself and pick it apart and finish up chapter 8, we go through the normal preliminaries and just let you know that if you enjoy Loving the Scriptures and you haven't done so already, I would strongly encourage you to follow and subscribe my show wherever you listen to this podcast. Also follow me on X. The handle is @LTScripts. That's LTSCRIPTS, which stands for Loving the Scriptures. And also don't forget to order a copy of my book, Signs of the End: What Did Jesus Say About His Own Return and the Events That Point to It. It's a study of Jesus' words to his disciples in the Olivet Discourse, or Mark 13, Matthew 24, and Luke 21. By the way, I just want to make clear, I don't usually do this, but I think it's good to just kind of maybe every once in a while just throw out this reminder regarding the book. As I said, this is a study of the Olivet Discourse. It's pretty much studying that whole section and just picking apart and seeing what Jesus is meaning when he's communicating these things to the disciples, okay? What the book is not anything that says, okay, we're looking for these particular specific signs so that we know that once this happens, then, the coming of Christ is like 3 days away or 5 days away or 6 weeks away or anything like that. No date setting or anything of that sort, so just so you understand, this is an actual study of the text itself. We're not dealing with any sort of guesswork or as far as that's concerned or anything like that. So if that's a concern of yours as it relates to the book, don't worry about that. That's not what the book is all about. That's not what the book entails. So if you're interested in eschatology and you have questions about that particular passage of Scripture, again, Mark 13, Matthew 24, and Luke 21, then I would strongly encourage you to order a copy of the book. As usual, I will leave links in the episode description so that you can go, and those links take you to either Amazon.com or BarnesandNoble.com. You can place an order in any one of those areas. If you prefer to look for it in another place, you're perfectly free to do that and see if it's available through that avenue that's preferred to you. So I hope you order a copy. I hope you read it, and I hope that you're blessed by it. Okay, so also before we get into the text, I just want to wish all of you a Merry Christmas, because if by the time this this episode drops, we'll be a few days away from Christmas. If we keep up with the normal drop day is Sunday, which I don't see any reason why that wouldn't be the case. I don't plan on changing that pattern, at least not right now. So if you're hearing this before Christmas, then hear what I say from me to you, and saying that I wish you a very Merry Christmas. What a wonderful time of year, and what a wonderful thing that we celebrate when it comes to the first coming of our Savior, our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, who enters into the world, enters into human history as fully God, fully man, to come ultimately. We focus a lot on the birth and everything, and we might read the birth narratives and everything, but never forget what ultimately is being aimed at here when we're talking about the coming of Jesus Christ and the birth of Jesus Christ, is that it's ultimately has to do with him coming and sacrificing himself for his people. All right. And so, it's truly a wonderful thing to behold, and just to really think about that. I mean, I always seem to have, Philippians 2 in my mind. I mean, I have Philippians 2 in my mind in a lot of times, but I mean, especially around this time of year, as it relates to Christmas, where it's talking about he did not consider equality with God something to be grasped, but made himself nothing and put himself in the form of a bondservant, and that sort of thing. The Carmen Christi, again, you can go and read that in Philippians chapter 2. And that really, I think that passage really captures the essence of what we really celebrate and rejoice over when it comes to the Christmas season. And I don't want you to go through this season without that in your mind as well. And so, in the midst of all the things that we normally do as far as Christmas traditions and everything, if you're one who really recognizes the reason behind the season, then I would encourage you maybe to take some time to read Philippians 2, in addition to, maybe some of the things that you regularly read during the Christmas season, whether that's the birth narrative in Luke chapter 2 or whatever the case may be. That's just a suggestion. I'm not saying that you're doing it wrong if you don't read or consider Philippians 2 or anything like that. That's not Christmas is not a biblically mandated holiday anyway. You don't even have to celebrate Christmas. So that wouldn't be right for me to say that you're doing it wrong if you don't consider Philippians 2. It's just a suggestion, and just opening up more just kind of our biblical mindset as it relates to this time of year, and taking some time to chew on it and meditate on it, maybe leading your family, if you're talking about, your spouse and your kids and everything, and just leading in a discussion of what that passage says and what it means and how it ties into Christmas and what Jesus did in coming down to sacrifice himself for his people. So, anyway, just a really wonderful time of year, wonderful things that we celebrate. And I hope that as we have the religious aspects of that in mind, that we never forget, what the birth of Christ ultimately leads to. In other words, let's try our best not to leave Jesus in the manger. Now, I understand that when we're talking about the birth, and even if we just talk about the incarnation itself, we are dealing with a significant event in human history. I mean, God came down and visited us on earth in the form of a man, in a full human being, while being still 100% man. 100% God. That is truly, truly incredible. And that is a significant part of redemptive history. But also remember what that leads to. It leads to the cross ultimately, and even an empty tomb. And then we have the ascension of Jesus Christ, who is right now sitting at the right hand of the Father. And one day, we don't know the day or the hour, but one day he's going to come back. He's going to return. And just think about this: when he comes back and returns, and he does away with sin fully, finally, and we're brought into his presence on earth in a new heavens and a new earth. All of that we will receive and will experience by the grace of God is only possible because of what Jesus Christ did in his first coming. So it's the first coming, the first advent, that makes the second advent and all the blessings thereof possible. So you see how all of these things are linked together and how wonderful those things are. And so I guess it's just really just a call of having the full redemptive, diagram in view here, even as we celebrate the birth of our Lord Jesus Christ. So anyway, all that to say, Merry Christmas. I hope you have a wonderful time with family. If you're traveling with family or traveling to see family in other places, please be safe. Just Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year as well. Just to remind you, I will not be doing an episode. I mean, at least not in this form. After this, in this part of the year, the ending of the year, we're going to take a break between the end of chapter 8 and the beginning of chapter 9, and what we'll do there. I'll just share a sermon with you that comes from the Attributes of God series that I've been sharing with you, that I preached, hard to believe, 2 years ago. Because I started that series because I preached once a month. Doing that series of the Attributes of God. I started that series on New Year's Day of 2023. So we're about to enter into 2025. So it's been 2 years, and I just can't believe it. I can't believe how fast time has gone. So anyway, we've already looked at a few. We've looked at the sovereignty of God, we looked at the holiness of God, and we looked at the wrath of God. And so in this one that I'm going to share with you, which will be in the next episode, we're going to be looking at the mercy of God. So I'll be sharing that sermon with you that talks about the mercy of God, which is, I think, a fitting thing to talk about. And I made this apparent, just as I preached this in real time a couple of years ago, coming out of talking about the wrath of God, but the wrath of God and understanding the importance of knowing about that, but seeing how God is merciful as well. So we're going to get into that and in that sermon, and I hope it's something that truly blesses you as you listen to that. Okay, so that's a little bit of a longer preliminary, monologue than I'm used to doing. So let's go ahead and get into the text here. So again, we're in John chapter 8. This is the last section that we have here. And so just remember, just from the brief review that I gave you, just a little bit ago, in talking about what Jesus has been saying about them being of their father, the devil, and then also even saying that they are ones who do not know God. It leads then into this whole thing of what we saw when we read the text, what we saw in verse 48, where it says, the Jews answered him, he says, are we not right in saying that you are a Samaritan and have a demon? Now, just at face value, you look at that and you get the impression, you get the understanding, hey, what they're saying about Jesus isn't really nice. That's not a nice thing to say. I mean, especially when we're talking about saying that, aren't we right in thinking that you have a demon, right? And that's really where our minds will focus on, and we'll talk about that here in a minute. But what do they mean here when they say, are we not right in saying that you are a Samaritan and have a demon? What's this whole thing about a Samaritan? Now, you may or may not remember, or you may or may not be familiar already just by, maybe your own understanding of Scripture. But you may not remember when we were in chapter 4 and we were talking about the Samaritan woman at the well. We talked a little bit about the whole thing with Samaritans and how the Jews and the Samaritans are ones who didn't get along. And the reason why is because there was a hatred. I mean, there was a two-way hatred. Jews hated Samaritans, Samaritans hated Jews. But if you look at this from the Jews' perspective, the reason why they didn't like the Samaritans is because they were seen as dirty half-breeds. Because if you go back into Old Testament history, what you had was, when you had the exile that took place in the Old Testament, you had a small number. I mean. Of Jews who remained in the land. Mostly they were of the poorer class, and you had Gentiles who came in and took over the land. And eventually, what happened was you had those Jews, the small handful of Jews that remained, and they intermarried with the Gentiles who came in and settled the land. And so therefore you have a mixture of Jews and Gentiles who later became known as Samaritans. Now, from a purely Jewish perspective at that time, that is a big no-no. So when you have the Samaritans in Jesus's day, the way that the Jews looked at them is that you are not of this people. You are not of us, and therefore, you're dirty, and that sort of thing, because you're half-breeds, you have Gentile blood in you, and that sort of thing. And so there was hatred that way. And of course, again, that's bad. There was also hatred from the Samaritans towards the Jews. Samaritans were ones who gave the Jews, the Israelites, trouble even in the Old Testament when they returned back to the land. And I think that that's something that we briefly talked about before when we were exploring John chapter 4. If it wasn't when we were talking about John chapter 4, it may have been at some other case. But, just so you know, there was, the Samaritans tended to be troublemakers too on their side as well. And so when you had the Israelites who returned after Cyrus gave his declaration, and you had these people who, for example, were trying to rebuild the wall through the leadership of Nehemiah, or trying to rebuild the temple. You had certain people who came and were opposing them and were causing them trouble. They weren't called Samaritans in the passage, but who they were Samaritans. Those were the people that were of that group. So you can kind of see, from Jews to Samaritans and Samaritans to Jews, there really wasn't any sort of good relationship between the two. I think it would be important to add on to there as well that the Samaritans, in really true fashion, they were familiar with certain things biblically, but they also had their own idea about things theologically as well that did not line up with the Judaistic way of thinking, which was not good. In fact, you could probably rightly say that there were some things within the Samaritan religious system that were heretical and were rightly offensive. And so, that didn't help anything as far as trying to gain positive sight from the Jews toward the Samaritans, the fact that they held to certain heretical teachings and things like that. So I think when it comes to here, then when it's talking about the Jews and saying, aren't we right in saying that you are a Samaritan? It's they weren't saying that because they were thinking that Jesus was literally a Samaritan. They knew better than that. I think they knew that that Jesus was a full-blooded Jew and everything. But it was said as an insult and it was an indication of just how much they hated him. Now you have that part of it, but again, as I said, there are certain theological aspects that play into this as well. That these Jews here in John chapter 8 could be making reference to as well. The fact that the Samaritans really didn't hold 100% a clear and good and biblical and scriptural outlook on God and the things of God, is important to note, because if they're calling Jesus a Samaritan and they have the theological aspects of these things in mind, that could tie into why they call Jesus a Samaritan. And that's not necessarily saying that they're saying that they think that Jesus holds to the same theological views that the Samaritans do. But again, it could just be a matter of them saying that you are off your rocker when it comes to the things that you say theologically, just like the Samaritans are off their rocker in some of the things that they think and they believe theologically as well. So that could play into it as well. But so there you have this whole thing where he says, are we not right in saying that you are a Samaritan and have a demon? So that's the other thing that plays into this whole thing. They accuse Jesus of having a demon. And again, I don't think it's necessarily a matter of them saying or thinking that you literally are possessed by a demon. Maybe to a certain extent, maybe some of them maybe did. But the whole idea of them saying that Jesus has a demon is their way of saying that you are what you're saying is so crazy that it descends into the whole realm of insanity. You're crazy for the things that you're saying, and it's certainly not anything of God. If anything, because of the things that you're saying, it's so crazy it could be marked as being part of the demonic. Okay, and that's kind of the idea that you have going on there. That's why they use that term of demon to describe Jesus. And just imagine that. Just imagine. Those are words that these religious Jews were saying to the actual Son of God himself. That's truly a mind-blowing thing. So they're saying you're crazy, you're insane, essentially. And it's important. It's interesting to know, after Jesus has just finished saying, and again, this is something that we looked at in the last episode. After Jesus had said that they are children of the devil, the Jews come back by saying that everything that he has said lends them to, quote unquote, rightly, although I say quote unquote because it's not right, but it leads them to, quote unquote, rightly conclude that he is on the wrong side and that he has a demon. So that any linkage between him and the evil spiritual realm and everything like that is more of a correct thing than him saying to them that they are of their that they are of their father the devil. So you kind of see the back and forth that is going on there between those two people. Okay, so as we continue on here, and we are in verse 49, where Jesus answers back, and it says, Jesus answered, I do not have a demon, but I honor my Father, and you dishonor me. Okay, so it's just a simple statement that Jesus makes here. He just comes back. He says, I don't have a demon, and that sort of thing. He talks about honoring God and everything. So let's focus on this whole thing. Of course, there's a whole thing where he says, I do not have a demon. And he just really, what follows there isn't like a long apologetic as to why he could not be considered as somebody who has a demon or that sort of thing. He just goes straight to something that, just another angle, so to speak, of things that he's been saying all along to these Jews as it relates to their thought and their perspective on their own relationship with God, or maybe we can say lack thereof. He says, I do not have a demon, but I honor the Father, and you dishonor me. So somebody, let's just think of it like this, okay? Someone who has a demon does not honor God. True? I mean, I think that's pretty straightforward. And so when Jesus says, I do not have a demon, I honor God. In other words, I do things that are totally against what somebody who has a demon would do. Okay, that's the whole idea of saying that I honor God. So if I honor God, or if anybody honors God, I mean the conclusion would be that they don't have a demon. Okay, so Jesus honors God. So Jesus does not have a demon. But yet he goes on to say, attached to that, he says that you dishonor me. Now, the Jews dishonor a man in the person of Jesus Christ who honors God. Now, because of who God is and because of Christ's relationship to the Father, the Jews dishonor God because they dishonor Christ. And again, really, that's just really a reiteration of what we've been talking about, and actually really what Jesus has been saying all along and what Jesus has been laying forth. I mean, pretty much he's been one who continually says that I report and I see what the Father sees and what the Father tells me and what the Father and I both see. And so, again, essentially he's saying the things that I'm saying is the message that comes from the Father who sent me. So, anybody who would object to what Jesus says, naturally, that would lead to the conclusion that they object to what God himself says. All right, that's why this whole thing about these Jews saying that we have one Father, even God, is a delusional sort of thing that they themselves are saying, because they don't even recognize the Son who is in their midst, who came from the Father. And it's not like this is something that just comes out of the blue where it's just totally unrecognizable. Again, if we go back to other things that we've said in the past and just what we've studied in the book of John, the Father himself testifies about the Son, both through the works that the Son is doing and even through the testimony of Scripture, which we could say is the Father's testimony. Going back to John chapter 5, again, he says that you guys study the Scriptures diligently because you think that in them you have life, but these are the Scriptures that testify about me, and yet you refuse to come to me to have life. Okay, so really these are people who are without excuse. So These are people who are saying that Jesus has a demon. Jesus says, I don't have a demon, and you can tell I don't have a demon because I'm one who honors God. But you people dishonor me. And the fact that you dishonor me, naturally, I mean, if you put two and two together, would lead to the conclusion that you guys do not honor God as well. And that's the point that's being made here. Now, he goes on, going on into verse 50, where he says, yet I do not seek my own glory. And the reason Jesus lays that out is because, again, if you're talking about this whole thing where Jesus says that you dishonor me, it could, by Jesus pointing that out, people can take that to mean that, you don't honor me, but you need to honor me because I am one who is worthy of being honored. Now, Jesus is one who is worthy of honor. He is worthy of praise and exaltation because he is God. But that's not the point that Jesus is making in this particular text. The fact that he points this out, the whole thing of what he says about you dishonor me, does not mean that he is glorifying himself. Okay, and that's the point that Jesus is making there. So he says, yet I do not seek my own glory. There is one who seeks it, and he is the judge. Okay, so that's really that's what you have going on there. So, seeking honor and everything. There is one who seeks glory, and that's the Father. We kind of get that sense, and we kind of get that understanding even earlier. Again, if you consider John chapter 5, for example. And in verse, let's see, I think it's 22. John chapter 5, verses 22 and 23. And this is Jesus talking. He says, for the Father judges no one, but has given all judgment to the Son. Now listen to verse 23, that all may honor the Son as they honor the Father. Okay? So that's the purpose. That's so the Father seeks to see the Son glorified, or if you want to say honored, exalted, that sort of thing, just as he is honored. And so in a very same way here, we have the Father who's the one who seeks the Son's glory. He's the one who seeks it. Now, since the Father seeks the Son's glory, his perspective is all that truly matters, okay? And so he's the judge between, the Father, rather, is the judge between Jesus and the Jews that he's interacting with right now. And so one thing that it should be pretty clear by now is that the Father judges in the Son's favor. I mean, really, if you think about it, this isn't anything new. Even if we go in the synoptics, the very beginning of Jesus' ministry, after the baptism of Jesus, remember the whole thing, it says the voice of the Father coming from heaven as the Spirit descends on the Son like a dove, and he says, this is my Son whom I love, with him I am well pleased, right? So that's the Father's favor towards the Son, all right? And so the Father judges in the Son's favor. Because the Father is the one who seeks the Son's glory and wants to see him with favor and honor and that sort of thing. Okay. Now, as you go on into verse 51, he says, truly, truly, I say to you, if anyone keeps my word, he will never see death. Now, as we see after that verse in verse 52 and following, that's something that really, sets the Jews in a tizzy, and they say, okay, this confirms everything that we've been saying all along, but we'll get to that in a second. There's this whole thing that Jesus says about keeping his words, all right? So again, truly, truly, I say to you, if anyone keeps my word, he will never see death. That's a big statement to make. And Jesus has been making a lot of big statements. I mean, a lot of the things that Jesus has said here, from a first century Jewish perspective, are pretty huge. We might not necessarily appreciate it as much. That's why, getting into the text and really studying it and looking at it, as closely as we do sometimes is beneficial, so that we can stop and let our brains process a little bit and say, you realize what Jesus is actually saying here? And once we understand that, we can say, oh, so I understand, not in a positive way, but I understand, why these Jews, if they're in an unbelieving reprobate state would respond the way that they do to Jesus and what he says, okay, in the midst of their unbelief. Okay, so when he talks about they will never taste that they will never, anyone who keeps my word, he will never taste death. What he's talking about as far as death there is spiritual death, and more specifically, the second death. All right. Now, the Jews themselves, when they're hearing about Jesus talking about death and everything like that, they have the physical aspect of death in mind, the same kind of death that everybody, which includes you and me, will experience. The whole thing of physical death. That's what they think. But really, what Jesus is talking about, when what he's really referring to there is the spiritual death, which ultimately is described, as we see in Revelation, as the second death. And so the thing that Jesus is talking about when he's talking about those who keep his word, they will not taste death. I mean, obviously, that doesn't mean that people will all live forever physically. Again, like I said, you and I, if we don't live until the time of Christ's second coming, we will die physically, just like everybody who has preceded us has died. But in the words of Jesus himself in John chapter 11, when he identifies himself as the resurrection and the life, keep in mind what he says in verse 25 of chapter 11, where he says, I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, and you can connect that, just as a side note, you can connect that to the whole thing of keeping his word, because believing in him and keeping his word go hand in hand. Those who believe will keep his word. I mean, I think it's essentially one connection that you make. But anyway, I digress. Whoever believes in me, though he die, so there's an acknowledgement of physical death, though he die, yet shall he live. And everyone who lives and believes in me shall never die. Okay? And so basically, again, when Jesus is talking about being the resurrection and the life, he's looking forward to the ultimate resurrection, the resurrection of the believer. When Jesus Christ comes back, everybody will be resurrected. And again, Jesus mentions this in John chapter 5. Some will be resurrected to eternal life, and then the others will be resurrected to judgment, right? But there will be a resurrection, and that those who believed in him, they will be raised to life, and they will live forever. So even though they die, they will live. All right. And so that's the idea. That's another way that we can look at this as it relates to Jesus's words in John chapter 8. Now, again, like I said, the Jews didn't really have a firm understanding of this, or rather they misunderstood what Jesus was saying here. Now, Jesus is saying that life hinges on his words, which must be received. Okay. And so I'm putting you in the position of seeing where the Jews are coming from when they make the objections that they're going to make a little bit later here, because it says here, just based on what he says, again, what I said is that by taking the words of Jesus there about life hinges on his word. Thus, it is from Christ that people get life, which implies that Jesus will not die. Okay. And it's that thought that sets the Jews off. And so that's how they respond as they do. Let's look at it. Let's look at their response in verse 52. The Jews said to him, now we know that you have a demon. Abraham died, as did the prophets. Yet you say, if anyone keeps my word, he will never taste death. Are you greater than our father Abraham, who died? And the prophets died. Who do you make yourself out to be? Okay, so that's the Jews' response. That's the way that they answer this whole thing. Now, if we were to kind of change the words a little bit here, and give it a little bit more, more of something a little bit more as far as a quote goes. Basically, what they're saying is, how can you claim such authority over life when such stellar people like Abraham and the prophets died, right? And you're saying that this is something that depends on your words, which, how does that even work? Did you exist back at that time? We'll get to that a little bit, because they're gonna go that direction here. But I mean, again, it says the whole thing is that how can you claim that sort of authority when you have people like Abraham and the prophets who died? which would seem to indicate, if we're going by Jesus' words here, that they were not really as great people as everybody else thought that they were. Because if what Jesus is saying is true and they died, and again, they're thinking solely on physical terms, then that creates a big problem as far as, how we label people like Abraham and the prophets. And so they're saying you must think you're greater than they are in order to make this claim. And so who do you think you are? In other words, and again, the way that the text lays it out is that who do you make yourself out to be? Now, again, so they were thinking that this was Jesus's way of propping himself up again, of exalting himself, of glorifying himself, which he's worthy of all those things. But from a human perspective and from the Jews' perspective, that's one thing that is certainly not within the whole realm of where Jesus belongs as somebody who is high and exalted and lifted up and somebody who needs to be glorified. Now, Jesus is one who says that he is not seeking his own glory, all right? And he's going to repeat that in his answer back. So essentially, again, that's the whole that's the whole essence of what the Jews are pushing back on. After Jesus is saying that if anyone keeps my words, he will never taste death, and say, well, what about Abraham? So by the mere fact that Abraham died and the prophets died, you must think that you're greater than them, and so therefore you're exalting yourself and glorifying yourself, so forth and so on, blah, 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 right? And then they conclude the whole thing of who do you make yourself out to be? Now, Jesus, in verse 54, it says, Jesus answered, if I glorify myself, my glory is nothing. It is my Father who glorifies me, of whom you say he is our God. Okay. So again, let's go back there. He says, if I glorify myself, then my glory means nothing. And he proceeds to say that the Father glorifies me. So again, it's a little bit similar to what we talked about before, after Jesus had talked about, not seeking his own glory. And that really, it's the Father's perspective in all of this that really tells the whole story. And it's the Father who seeks to glorify the Son. So again, we're seeing some similar language here, even as it relates to this. Now, here's the thing, Jesus glorifying himself doesn't accomplish anything. That's why you can say that my glory means nothing. In this situation, if we were talking about Jesus glorifying himself in this context here, what Jesus is saying is that glorifying myself doesn't accomplish anything. The fact that the Father glorifies the Son is what counts, right? And if the Father glorifies the Son, then what the Son says about his authority over life is true. If it wasn't true, then the Father wouldn't seek to glorify the Son. That would not happen. But since the Father does seek to glorify the Son, then that says a lot about what Jesus is saying about his authority over life. So you see how those connections are made there. And so here, again, it's just another instance of seeing the Jews talking out of turn here as it relates to their judgment on the things that Jesus is saying here. Okay. Now, did you notice there? And again, this is still in verse 54. Again, where he says, if I glorify myself, my glory is nothing. It is my Father who glorifies me, of whom you say he is our God. Right? So if the Father was truly their God, this is how the thinking goes. If the Father was truly their God, they would not be against the Son. Again, really, it's really just as simple as that, right? But the fact that they are against the Son shows that they do not know the Father. Okay, they do not know the Father, and that's what Jesus is going to take that, and he's going to contrast that to himself as somebody who does actually know the Father, right? So, and again, Jesus has already answered this whole thing about them claiming the Father as their God and that sort of thing, and Jesus putting that down by saying that God is not your father, you are actually of your father, the devil, and that sort of thing. That goes back to the previous section that we looked at in the last episode, okay? But here they said, and again, he says, it's just interesting. He says, of whom you say he is our God. It's almost as if Jesus is saying, this is what you say, This, I mean, you yourself have said this. I'm not saying this. You're saying this. You're saying he is our God. So if that's what you say and that's what you believe, then really you shouldn't have a problem with this, but you do. And the reason why you have a problem with it is because you do not know him. You do not know him. Verse 55, but you have not known him. Again, that's what it all comes down to. I know him, right? So you have not known him. I know him. If I were to say that I do not know him, I would be a liar like you, but I do know him and keep his word. Okay. So that's quite a bit that Jesus is saying there. So again, he says that you have not known him, which is proved by this whole thing of how you're responding to what I'm saying. I know him, and if I said that I didn't know him, I'd be a liar like you. He would be a liar like his enemies. He would be of their same class. But what Jesus is doing is making a distinction between him, who again is one who honors God, and those who do not honor him, which is his enemies. He has already established that they are liars themselves. Why? Because they are of their father, the devil, the father of lies. The Son knows God, and he's declared it, and thus he tells the truth because he himself is the truth. As we're going to see in John 14, I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father but by me. Okay? But notice what he also says here. Not only this whole thing about knowing him, he says, I know him. If I were to say that I do not know him, I would be a liar like you. But I do know him, and I keep his word. Now, the whole thing of knowledge and keeping the word, again, it's something that goes hand in hand. Those aren't things that, I mean, not only just in the instance of Jesus here, but even with anybody who claims to know God, there's the connection between knowledge of God and keeping his word and keeping his commandments. Now, outside of Jesus, I mean, if we're talking about regular human beings, that's not anything that we do perfectly, but as a style of life, we are ones who walk according to the ways of Christ and what's laid out according to his word. Okay, so knowledge of God and keeping his word are linked. The Jews did not keep God's word. So again, this is something that shows that they don't know God. Now, just to turn your attention, because this is something, if we're going to go even pulling from the writings of John elsewhere, particularly in his epistle of 1 John, we see him lay this out pretty clearly, specifically in 1 John chapter 2, verses 4 through 6. And it's laid out plain and clear here. In verse 4, it says, whoever says, I know him, right? So there we go. The whole thing of making a claim of knowing God, which these Jews did. Whoever says, I know him, but does not keep his commandments is a liar, and the truth is not in him. There you go. There you go. That perfectly describes the Jews that Jesus is talking to in John chapter 8. In chapter 2, verse 5 of 1 John, I mean, he goes on to say that on the positive side, but whoever keeps his word, in him truly the love of God is perfected. By this we know, that we are in him. Whoever says he abides in him ought to walk in the same way in which he walked. Okay, so there you see the difference there. Now, again, that's verse 4 specifically of that passage is a perfect description of what we're dealing with the Jews in here in John chapter 8. They are ones who would say, I know him, but they don't keep his commandments. And again, we can go back to this whole thing of this whole thing. These are people who are wanting to and of actually looking for ways to try and get rid of Jesus by killing him, which would be murder, right? All because they can't stand the truth that he's laying forth before them, right? And so Jesus is going to go on by pointing out more the opposite nature of their ways and their thinking by going back to this whole thing about Abraham. Because remember, before in the last section, we saw that they claimed to be Abraham's children. It says Abraham is our father. And Jesus is saying, Are you sure about that? Sort of thing. So even when you get up there into verse 56, he says, your father Abraham rejoiced that he would see my day. He saw it and was glad. Now, again, before what Jesus was laying out here was laying out in a demonstration that these people truly were not children of Abraham, because if they were, they would be doing the works that Abraham did. So the fact that Jesus comes back here, he says, your father Abraham rejoiced. I think that Jesus, I read that. I read into that and see that really, I think Jesus is using a dash of sarcasm there. As if to, again, going back to the whole thing, if this is what you claim. And so, again, making a comparison between them who claim to be children of Abraham and what Abraham actually did, and how those two comparisons are total opposites of each other. So if they're total opposites of each other, how can they themselves be actual children of Abraham, right? And so Jesus is saying, okay, your quote unquote father Abraham, as if to say that's what you claim, but it's really not the truth. Your father Abraham rejoiced that he would see my day. He saw and was glad. Now notice you have two different perspectives here. You have the future aspect of this and you have the past. The future of this is saying, your father Abraham rejoiced that he would see my day. And then the past aspect, he saw it and was glad. Now, what exactly does this mean? I mean, even if you take this whole thing of he saw my day, I mean, what are we talking about here? I don't think anybody is 100% knows for sure. You can draw clues from this in Hebrews chapter 11, but as far as specifics go, I mean, that's just left up to speculation. Now, this whole thing about seeing his day, now that could refer to Jesus's actual days when in the times that he existed, as well as the days of the consummated kingdom that Jesus would inaugurate, referring to the new heavens and the new earth, or to use the language of Hebrews 11, the city that is from heaven, right? And that's the whole thing. Now, it says that if you look at the past tense part of this, he says he saw it. He saw the days of Jesus. He saw Jesus' day and was glad. So how did he see it? How did he see Jesus' day? Again, that's where we're not entirely sure. Was it through a vision? Was it through a dream or that sort of thing? I don't know. We're not sure. But I mean, if you look at Hebrews 11, you get a sense that in some way and in some form, Abraham actually did see for himself Jesus' day. And again, was that through a vision? Was that through some other means? I don't know. But if you look at Hebrews 11, which is the famed so-called faith Hall of Fame, and when they're talking about Abraham, they talk about Abraham and they talk about Jacob and Sarah and that sort of thing. But Abraham is included in that mix in the previous verses there. And then you get to verse 13 of Hebrews 11, where it says, these all died in faith, not having received the things promised, but having seen them. And so there it is, having seen them and greeted them from afar, and having acknowledged that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. Right? So, and just to read further, for people who speak thus make it clear that they are seeking a homeland. If they had been thinking of that land from which they had gone out, they would have had opportunity to return. But as it is, they desire a better country that is a heavenly one. And there's the key there as far as what specifically they're looking at. So we're still, even from our perspective, are seeing something future here. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared for them a city. But again, what it boils down to, I mean, as far as our discussion here from John chapter 8, is what you see there in Hebrews 11:13. Having seen them and greeted them from afar. So there you get this idea. Abraham and other people, they saw this in some way, having seen this, and they greeted it from afar. So did Abraham actually see the days of Christ? I would say yes. not only by the words of Jesus, but also here but from the perspective of the writer of Hebrews. And again, how exactly that came to be or in what form that took, I don't know. And to what degree and to what extent did they see it? Did they see Jesus' day and the days that would be thereafter, which would ultimately be the new heavens and the new earth, since the writer of Hebrews is talking about a heavenly city? Very much possible. But again, there's a little bit of guesswork as far as the extent of that. But the whole thing is that Abraham saw it and he greeted it from afar. He didn't turn his back on it. He didn't reject it. He didn't gnash his teeth at it or anything like that. He greeted it from afar, according to the writer of Hebrews. And so here in John chapter 8, as Jesus continues to point this out, he says, he said, your father Abraham rejoiced that he would see my day. He saw it and was glad. So he was glad and he rejoiced over this whole thing. That's the whole thing. And that's the difference between Abraham and these Jews who claim to be children of Abraham. Abraham was glad, but unlike Abraham, the Jews were people who sought to kill Jesus because of what he was saying and the truth that he was bringing forth. That's opposite of their father, and that's not surprising because, as Jesus says, you are of your father, the devil, not of Abraham, but of the devil. So that's what you have going on there. So the fact that Jesus says this, he says that Abraham saw my day, and he was glad. Here's again where the whole lack of understanding of what Jesus is saying again comes full bloom here, because they think that Jesus is saying that he lived in the days of Abraham. But and so that naturally leads to their question of how could this be if he's not yet 50 years old? And so that's what they ask in verse 57. So the Jews said to him, you are not yet 50 years old, and have you seen Abraham? In other words, have you lived in the days of Abraham? If that were the case, you'd be hundreds and hundreds of years old, but you're not even 50. So how can you say that you've seen Abraham? That you've seen Abraham? That doesn't make any sense. Again, their dead hearts and minds are missing what Jesus is saying here. And so what this leads to is Jesus making the ultimate statement here. As I said, this will come to a fever pitch here, which, as you see at the end of this passage, leads to them picking up stones because they want to stone him. What was it that he said that made him want to do this? That made them want to kill Jesus? Well, here it is in verse 58, which I think is one of the most clear declarations that Jesus makes of himself as it relates to his deity and of him identifying himself as God. He says in verse 58, Jesus said to them, truly, truly, I say to you, before Abraham was, I am. There it is. There it is, the tetragrammaton, the covenant name of Yahweh that is identified in Exodus chapter 3, the name that God gave to Moses to say to the people if they asked what is this God's name? What is his name? And he was said, you were to answer, I am, has sent me to you. Okay, I am. And in the Greek, what that is ego eimi, I am. So that's what we're dealing with here. And just the way that the words are structured here, and even as we see here in this text, we understand what Jesus is saying here. Because, it says before Abraham was, and some translations say before Abraham was born, which is fine because that's really what's being alluded to. Before Abraham was, or before Abraham was born, I am. Okay. He didn't say before Abraham was born, I was. That's not what he says. He says before, and that would be the most natural thing that you would expect just from a human linguistic sort of perspective. But that's not what Jesus says here. He purposely says before Abraham was born, I am. Which again is, he uses the covenant name, Yahweh, which is that is a name for God himself. So when Jesus is saying I am, he is saying I am God. Okay. He proclaims to be God and he proclaims to be eternal. Because again, the whole thing of I am as opposed to I was, that tells you the whole thing. That tells you the whole story. He claims to be the eternal God. And that's what you're dealing with there. Now, here's the thing. In the last verse here of the chapter, verse 59, he says, so they picked up stones to throw at him, but Jesus hid himself and went out of the temple. So they hear Jesus loud and clear. I remember I was teaching a class at the mission years ago, and this passage came up. I don't think this was what we were studying, but I read this and I brought this up, and somebody said, well, couldn't Jesus have said something different, or maybe they didn't understand what he was saying? I said, no, trust me, they understood perfectly well what he was saying. If they're picking up stones to stone him as a result of what he was saying, Jesus could have easily said, whoa, hold on, you misunderstand what I'm saying here. I'm not saying that I'm God, okay? So put the stones down and things like, no, Jesus didn't say that, because Jesus was making a firm declaration of who he is in deity. I am God. I am the covenant God, Yahweh. The God, and if we want to use the familiar term, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, right? That's who Jesus claimed to be. Now, here's the thing, though, as we start to wind this down here, they picked up stones to stone him. Was it simply because of his claim to deity? I mean, that's part of it, but I would say that it's not the whole thing. There's a little bit more to it, because here's the thing. Jesus has been making claims to deity. This isn't the first time that Jesus has been making claims to deity. He's made claims to deity before. Now, granted, if you look at places like John chapter 5, he says, I'm working as the Father is working, and I still am working, or what? I'm sorry. What does that say? I butchered that. In John chapter 5, my Father is working until now, and I am working. People understood him to be making a claim to deity because he's making himself equal with God, and so they wanted to kill him. So that's nothing new. But I mean, even in everything that we've been looking at in chapter 7 and chapter 8, you see, this whole thing, specifically where he says, unless you believe that I am he, you will die in your sins. And in the Greek, it's the way that it's constructed again is unless you believe that I am, you will die in your sins, right? So there's the whole thing of having to believe that Jesus is God, I believe, is plays in big to what Jesus is communicating there. And I think that they would have understood that to a certain degree. So again, it's, Jesus has been making these claims before, and this isn't anything new. So Jesus says it again. Now, one might say that they've just reached the end of their rope. They're just got really tired of saying this. And so when Jesus says this again, then they pick up stones to stone him. And maybe they are at the end of their ropes. They're tired of hearing this guy, and they're saying, okay, now we're really going to complete the deed of what we truly desire to do and kill this guy. Maybe that's the case, but I want you to consider something here. And what's going to be required here is just to take our minds back ever so briefly to what someone like John the Baptist said. And he said, and John the Baptist is one who says this in a positive sense, obviously, because we're talking about John the Baptist. And so in chapter 1 and in verse 15, I believe. Yeah, in chapter 1, verse 15, it says a parenthetical note here written by John. It says, John bore witness about him being Christ. John bore witness about him and cried out, this was he of whom I said, he who comes after me ranks before me because he was before me. And take note of the last part of that sentence there. Ranks before me. So he's the preeminent one. He ranks before me. Why? Because he was before me. And so Jesus, not only in John chapter 8, not only identifying himself as God by saying that I am, but isn't there a certain hint, even with the way he says things related to Abraham, before Abraham was, I am. He's saying that I was before Abraham. And obviously he's saying he was before these people here in John chapter 8. So he was before them. And so therefore, obviously, along with his identity as the I am, and saying that he is one who is eternal, before Abraham was, I am. He says, I rank before Abraham. And again, they say that they're children of Abraham. So that probably adds to the offense of this. But if he ranks before Abraham, then Jesus is saying, I rank before you guys as well. I'm preeminent over you as well. Okay? So think of it like this, from their perspective, from the Jewish perspective. All right? From their perspective, it's bad enough that he claims to be deity. But now he emphasizes that he has real authority over them, and that they cannot abide by. And again, this is, I think that the whole thing of him suggesting his authority isn't anything that's new either. It's just something, it's just brought out here in verse 58 in such an emphasized way, I think, that it to them is the last straw. And they're ones who are saying, there's no way in the world that you can claim to be God and therefore be over us by ranking before us. Not a chance. And so I think that plays into the whole thing of setting them off. And so therefore they pick up stones to stone them, to stone him, because of the implications behind this. Now, as it says there in the last part of verse 59, but Jesus hid himself and went out of the temple. So this whole time that we've been seeing in chapter 7 and up to this point in chapter 8, Jesus has been in the temple. Now he leaves and he hides himself from them. Why? Because Jesus is afraid? No, it's because of what we've been seeing pretty consistently, mostly in chapter 7, where they say they were looking to kill him or they wanted to kill him and arrest him, but nobody laid a hand on him because his time had not yet come. This is essentially the same thing, except it's not stated narratively in the text where it says that his time had not yet come. We're familiar with that now. That's been repeated like 2 or 3 times within the last couple of chapters here. They pick up stones to stone him, to kill him, but his time has not yet come. It will come by God's own authority. It will come on his timing, on his timetable, but it is not now. And what we're going to see is that as Jesus leaves the temple, now he's going to have an encounter with somebody. We've been surrounded. Let's look at it this way. We've been surrounded so much by unbelief in these last couple of chapters. And we still will be in the next chapter as well. But there's a little bit of a ray of sunshine and encouragement when we come in contact, or when Jesus comes in contact with this blind man, this man who's born blind, who Jesus is going to miraculously heal. And you're going to see his belief, and actually the kind of a little bit of the snarkiness of this blind man towards the Jews who are questioning him and trying to bring to doubt the things that Jesus is doing and the fact that he's from God and that sort of thing, which is I think is actually really spectacular. We'll probably get to that in a few weeks, but as Jesus is leaving the temple, as his life is on the line because they're picking up stones to stone him, we have Jesus who sets time aside for this man, because this man, unbeknownst to him, has a preset divine purpose in everything that's about to unfold as far as healing his blindness and the things that he's going to say thereafter, in the midst of this whole thing of after healing the man of his blindness. Okay, but here again, I mean, we're going to talk about the whole thing of connecting the whole concept of physical blindness with spiritual blindness. And Jesus is going to talk about those sorts of things after he performs this miracle, mainly in John chapter 10. But here, I mean, even though the term blindness really isn't used, you see spiritual blindness full force and in full bloom with these Jews that Jesus has been interacting with over these last 2 chapters. Okay. And now Jesus is just going to flesh it out with blind and seeing language. And we're going to have a visual aid with a physical healing of blindness that Jesus is going to use to point out that spiritual reality of spiritual blindness. Okay, so that's what's ahead. But hopefully you can see now, even all the more what Jesus had to deal with, and it really points out in a very alarming and tragic and sad way, just how the hard, rebellious, reprobate heart, what that looks like. It's being fleshed out in these Jews who, again, are the most religious of people, that you wouldn't expect, or you would hope you wouldn't expect to see something like this from religious Jews. But this is what you see. And so they pit themselves against the Son of God himself to the point that they can't take it anymore. They take stones and they're going to stone him. But Jesus escapes from them and hides himself from them. And So yeah, but hopefully, once we get into chapter 9 in the new year, hopefully, we'll all be able to get into that little moment of light there as we see this blind man who's made to see, and just kind of the change in his life. So we have a positive thing that we see of somebody who believes. Now he's going to be surrounded by people who don't believe, and again, we'll talk about all of that and get into that when we get to that. And we're going to start that in a couple of weeks. So we'll leave things here for now. We're done with chapter 8. Next time, I'll be sharing a sermon with you from our Attributes of God series on the mercy of God. And then after that, in the new year, we will start John chapter 9. So I hope that this has been good and profitable and beneficial for you. Hopefully it's brought out the meaning of the text all the more as we continue to study these texts, and I hope that it works towards your transformation. So we'll leave it there. If you enjoy this program and you haven't done so already, as I mentioned before, go ahead and follow and subscribe to my show wherever you listen to this podcast. Follow me on X. The handle is @LTScripts. That's LTSERIPTS, which stands for Loving the Scriptures. And also order a copy of my book, Signs of the End. What did Jesus say about his own return and the events that point to it? Again, links in the episode description. I hope you read it, and I hope that you're blessed by it. And again, as I mentioned before, let me just repeat again, Merry Christmas to all of you. I hope you have a wonderful, wonderful Christmas and a Happy New Year. Please be safe if you're traveling, and we'll get back into things in the new year. Please, tune into and listen to the Mercy of God message that I'll be laying out for you as well. I hope that that's something that's good and profitable for you as well. All right. Well, I had a great time as normal going through Scripture with all of you. My name is Steve Gill, and I will see you right back here in a couple of weeks. But until then, Merry Christmas and have a wonderful New Year. Bye now.